Imagine one friend types reports twice as fast as the other, while the other friend bakes cookies that are twice as delicious. Even if one is better at both tasks, they can both benefit by focusing on what they're relatively better at. This is comparative advantage. In this video, we'll explore how specializing based on comparative advantage, rather than absolute advantage, creates more opportunities for trade and mutual benefit. Absolute advantage was all about measuring the cost of production and time spent, but we don't want to measure cost and time spent. We want to measure cost and opportunity cost. So we should measure cost in terms of the other things that are given up to produce that good. Okay. So in terms of an input, the opportunity cost of a task is hours this task takes, hours and the hours required to produce the alternative output, the other thing. The other way to think about it is in terms of units of goods. So think about the PPF. The opportunity cost of task X is the units of good Y that can be produced divided by the units of good X to be produced. So we're going to be using this one here to think about calculating our opportunity cost of producing genes and the opportunity cost of producing pharmaceutical vials in Vietnam and the United States. Okay. Using these opportunity costs, we'll have the idea of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the ability to do a task at a lower opportunity cost, meaning that a country has to give up less to produce that. So we're going to have what country has the comparative advantage in genes. This country then would give up less vials of pharmaceuticals to make a pair of genes. Okay. We're starting with our two countries and the information about how much one worker can produce in each of these countries. One worker can produce 100 pairs of genes in the US or 10,000 vials of pharmaceuticals. In Vietnam, one worker can produce 500 pairs of genes or 1,000 vials of pharmaceuticals. Down here, we're going to start filling in the opportunity costs for each of these products in both countries. Let's start with the opportunity cost of genes. This needs to be in terms of vials of pharmaceuticals. So our opportunity cost of genes, we're going to put in the number of pharmaceuticals in the numerator that one worker could make. That's the 10,000. And then we're going to divide by the number of pairs of genes, the good we're looking at, right? So the good we're looking at are genes, and so we can make 100 pairs of genes. So our opportunity cost will be 10,000 divided by 100. So simplify that down. That would be 100 vials of pharmaceuticals. The way you want to interpret this 100 is that every pair of genes produced in the United States, they have to give up 100 vials of pharmaceuticals. That's the trade-off or the opportunity cost. Okay. In Vietnam, we can do the same numbers. Our number of vials would be 1,000 divided by the 500 pairs of genes. And so our opportunity cost would be 2 vials. Okay. For every pair of genes produced in Vietnam, they have to give up 2 vials of pharmaceuticals. Now let's go to the opportunity cost of pharmaceuticals. So we want to put the number of genes in the numerator divided by the number of pharmaceuticals. So it would be 100 divided by 10,000. So that will be 1 over 100 pairs of genes. For Vietnam, that would be 500 divided by 1,000. It'll be 1/2 of a pair of genes. Okay. So the interpretation is every vial of pharmaceuticals costs 1/100th of a pair of genes in the United States, and in Vietnam, every vial of pharmaceuticals costs 1/2 a pair of genes. So comparative advantage then, the thing we're trying to actually get with using all these opportunity costs, is like what country has the ability to produce at a lower opportunity cost for that good. For genes, Vietnam only has to give up 2 vials of pharmaceuticals, where the US has to give up 100 vials. So Vietnam has comparative advantage in the production of genes. Now for pharmaceuticals, 1/100th is less than 1/2 a pair of genes, and so we know that the United States has comparative advantage in pharmaceuticals. Great. So now, a country cannot have comparative advantage in both goods. The reason is because of this trade-off. Notice how these are just the reciprocals of each other. We're just flipping them. And so if Vietnam has a lower number when it's 1,000 divided by 500, if we flip it, then it must have a higher number by definition. Okay, so given the fact here that Vietnam has comparative advantage in genes, the United States has comparative advantage in pharmaceuticals, right? They're never going to be the same ever. That's a little bit different than absolute advantage. Absolute advantage, the case where we could give up, the case where it's just about the number of like time spent, inputs, costs to produce something. They could be different, like we had in our example, or actually the United States could have absolute advantage in both. It could the United States could be more productive in producing everything, and have absolute advantage in everything. But we would still have Vietnam would still have comparative advantage in genes. Okay. Right. So to reiterate that, this is an important thing. Everyone has a comparative advantage in something, right? The United States has a comparative advantage in pharmaceuticals. Vietnam had comparative advantages in genes. The idea here is if you have the lowest opportunity cost in genes, by definition, you have the highest opportunity cost in pharmaceuticals. Now, how is trade going to work with this? Trade is going to flow from the country with the comparative advantage. What that means is that the United States produces those pharmaceuticals, the product it has a comparative advantage in, and it exports it to Vietnam. And we're going to call those Vietnamese imports. Right? Vietnam's going to produce the genes, and they're going to export them to the United States. The United States is going to import those genes. Okay? So if we go back to our table here, the United States is going to produce pharmaceuticals and send those pharmaceuticals to Vietnam. Vietnam's going to produce genes and send those genes to the United States in trade. They're both going to be made better off for this specialization in comparative advantage and allowing for trades to make everyone better off with more stuff in the world.